続きまして、世界保健機関 WHO 主席科学者ジェレミー・ファーラー様をお招きし、国立研究開発法人日本医療研究開発機構 AMED10 周年シンポジウムについてご講演を頂戴いたします。ジェレミー・ファーラー様は、ロンドン、エディンバラ、オックスフォード、メルボルンで神経学と感染症を学び、オックスフォード大学で免疫学博士号を取得。2013年から23年まで国際保健などの研究支援を目的とした医療研究財団ウェルカムトラストの理事長を務められ、現在は WHO 主席科学者としてご活躍されております。So please, Sir Jeremy Farrar, the floor is over to you.
Thanks very much indeed. It's always a... Sorry. Thanks very much indeed. It's always a great pleasure to join such a gathering, and at a 10-year anniversary birthday celebration, it's a particular pleasure. AMED is now out of its nappies and into its teenage life, or soon will be. And President Mishima, good luck. We all need good luck. It's been a real pleasure to be a friend of AMED since the start. I still remember sitting when I was head of Welcome. This would be 2013, 2014. And the first discussions about setting up AMED happened, I think, in 2014. And a very good colleague, the first president, President Makato, came to visit Welcome and many other countries and institutions to learn, to listen, and to think how best to set up such a new structure. It's not easy. It's not easy to change a way that science is funded within a country, but I think all countries need to consider the way that they fund science, and that's what I'll focus my talk on. So thanks very much for the invitation. I also am very proud of Japan, and as with Dr. Richard Hatchett, who's here, I think we're both recipients, proud recipients, and I've got the badge, Richard, you can borrow it after me, of the Order of the Rising Sun with the gold rays with neck ribbon, and I hugely appreciate the support of the government of Japan in that award, and speak, I'm sure, on behalf of Richard and myself to say thank you. I'm going to start. I very rarely use PowerPoint. Okay. The association between a country's health and a country's wealth has been known for many, many years. This is a wonderful video from Hans Rosling, who's tragically died far too young. During it, you'll see a time course from about 1800, I think, through to 2023, colored by continent. I'll show Japan, I hope, as it goes through. And essentially what it shows is your health of a country, population health, and your wealth are integrally linked. It only lasts a minute or so, and if it works, I really am a magician. So here we have life expectancy at birth. This is the year 1800, and here we have GDP per capita on the bottom. I believe I'm right in saying no, that the red dot there is Japan. And you can see that through the 19th century, the UK, which was at the start of the Industrial Revolution, wealth started to increase through the 19th century. And with that, started to increase life expectancy. But it wasn't really until the beginning of the dawn of the 20th century, with a dreadful event just coming up, First World War, and influenza pandemic of 1918, that wealth and life expectancy diverged globally. So now you see In red, the coming of India and China. In blue, the countries of Africa. In yellow, the countries of Europe and Asia. And you can see that as your wealth increases, but by 2023, this is China. Japan, I think, Japan is just about the most advanced in terms of gaining wealth and doing remarkable things in terms of its health. I think there are two questions that come from this. One is, what can we do as a world to decrease the inequality that exists between the countries largely in blue, which largely represent the continent of Africa, but not uniquely, and the countries here in the top right who have achieved wealth and achieved better health for their population. The other, and this will be the subject of the talk, is how do countries that have achieved middle income, or how do countries that have achieved high income, including Japan and my own of the UK, how do you retain that wealth in order that you can still afford what is coming in the 21st century? Because I think we are going to face some existential threats during the 21st century that if we don't consider now in the first quarter of this century, then we will not be able to respond through this century. I think if I close this now and go back to the PowerPoint. Sorry, perfect. My Japanese is really good. You can argue what the great challenges of the 21st century are, but I would argue, and many of them have been mentioned very beautifully just now from the European Commission, and just to put a plug, and I'm not paid to say this, but if there's any possibility of associating with Horizon Europe, I would jump at the chance. And speaking as a British citizen, having been in it, having been out of it, and now back in it, you're much better in it than out of it. And as an organization that brings together in a time of geopolitics and divided world, the idea that you come together as a group of nations to think and fund science, I think is absolutely extraordinary. So if Japan is thinking of joining, I would strongly encourage to do so. By Japan joining Horizon Europe, you will improve Horizon Europe within the European 27, and you will undoubtedly drive up the standards of science in Japan. That would be my experience from the United Kingdom. But the 21st century challenges that we face, we've heard about climate. Climate is going to affect just about everything we do. It's going to drive zoonotic spillovers that I'm sure Richard will talk about later in this afternoon. But it's also going to drive increasing inequality. The impact of climate globally will not be felt equally. It will increase human migration and displacement, either for economic or for climate reasons. We are living through an era which is showing huge geopolitical tensions, and that is unlikely to suddenly come to an end. Science is evolving at a pace and a dynamic which is absolutely extraordinary. I have not known in my whole professional career a time when science is moving as fast as it is today. And science does not move in a linear way. It moves in a series of steps. If as a country or a region you fall behind those progresses, catching up is extraordinarily difficult. It'll take you almost a generation to catch up. So if we think we are falling behind a little bit, and we heard that earlier from the article, quite harsh, in Nature in January, I think, of 2024, we must ask ourselves as a society and as a country, if we are falling behind, why we're falling behind, and what we're going to do to catch up. Because if we fall behind in science, I believe that we will fall behind in the ability to generate wealth for our citizens. That will lead to greater inequality, and ultimately health will suffer. So the graph of wealth versus health is intricately linked. And I believe that the key issue there is the scientific endeavor that a country invests in using its domestic resources. Japan is also at the forefront of demographic shifts, but it is not the only country. The whole world is going through a demographic shift, which is going to have, in my view at least as big an impact as is climate change on the world in the 21st century. Japan is ahead in its thinking in terms of that demographic shift, but if we don't address that demographic shift now in countries that are not yet quite where Japan is, then I think it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to continue to make the progress that we all want. And yet at that same time of those enormous global challenges, which are by their very nature international, we are going through a period when geopolitics is pulling us apart. The answer to climate change, demographic shifts, antimicrobial drug resistance, pandemics, is not narrow nationalism. And yet that is the world we're looking at the moment. If we allow that to continue, then the ability of individual countries to rise to that occasion is going to be very limited. The ability to work together is going to be absolutely crucial. And although when you look at the newspapers and you read the media, even if you, like me, almost dare not look at the newspapers in the morning, it is crucial that we actually rise up to this challenge and make the case that international cooperation is absolutely critical. It's critical for each and individual country, and it's critical for the 21st century's survival. At the same time as we face those enormous challenges, which are actually existential, we are also living in what I believe to be a golden scientific age. Just think, in the people in this room, in your careers, what has changed from when you graduated in medicine, in public health, in basic science, in political science. Just think what you do now and what you did at the start of your career, and tell me whether things are the same. Almost nothing. Some areas of infectious diseases, but in most parts of your public health and clinical work and scientific, where you started your career 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago and where it is today is completely different. The pace of change is truly remarkable. I've chosen some random ones here. The treatment and prevention of cancer. The coming of CAR T therapy in the top left. The ability to manipulate the immune system to treat your cancer. The coming of cancer vaccines. If you had said to me when I graduated there would be vaccines for cancer during my working life, I would have asked you what you were smoking. Mapping the human genome. Japan played an absolutely pivotal role in the mapping of the human genome. It's often sold, particularly by our colleagues across the Atlantic, that this was an American endeavor. Actually, 6 countries contributed enormously to the human genome project. The United States, without doubt, and Francis Collins, who was the director of National Institutes of Health, deserves enormous credit. But Japan played an absolutely pivotal role. France, Germany, China, UK came together and said, not only are we going to map this human genome, we're also going to ensure it's in the public domain. It's difficult to imagine in 2025 those countries coming back together again and taking on such an enormous project. Absolutely remarkable achievement. CRISPR-Cas9 and mRNA. The reason I put both CRISPR-Cas9 and mRNA up is because I've heard many times, you've heard it as well, wasn't it remarkable that in 2020 science moved so fast that we had mRNA vaccines? It didn't move. It moved fast in some ways. Clinical trials were better, regulation was better, logistics was better, CEPI played a huge role in this. But mRNA technology was invested in the 1980s. The Nobel Prize for mRNA was awarded for work done in the late 1980s. The lesson from that, if you want your breakthroughs in 2025 or in 2020 for the pandemic, as a country, as a world, you've got to invest in discovery basic science, because that will be what drives your breakthroughs, so-called breakthroughs, 10, 20, 30 years later. Artificial intelligence is now on everybody's agenda. But where is artificial intelligence being led from? And who is leading it? Increasingly, this balance between public sector and private sector is changing. So a lot of the work in artificial intelligence is now going on not necessarily through publicly funded research, but in private companies, and in private companies sometimes in private hands rather than even in publicly listed companies. That's a little bit scary, because the transparency and governance around where artificial intelligence is going to take us is not necessarily all in the public domain. And as a country, and as Europe as a region, if we fall behind in artificial intelligence, then all else of science will also fall behind. This is going to transform, along with quantum computing, I believe, the way we approach science over the next 25 years. So if one, in a non-linear system, that I've said science does not work in a linear path, it works through a series of steps which make a dramatic difference, which open up whole new fields of science. If you fall behind on one of those steps, and I do worry that outside China and the United States at the moment, we are in danger of falling behind in these two crucial areas of artificial intelligence and quantum computing. If we fall behind, then my concern is that the rest of science will also fall behind and we will find it extraordinarily difficult to catch up. I'm a biomedical scientist and a clinician, a public health person, but I've put social sciences up there because I do not believe that the first 5 headlines there, and you could have chosen 5 others, are going to be what holds us back. What will hold us back is our inability to persuade society that these advances are of benefit to them. And so as we develop technology, biotechnology, life sciences, as we develop artificial intelligence, as we develop quantum computing, if we leave behind social behavior and social sciences and an appreciation of what lies in societal trust, then I think we will not see the advances reaching the maximum number of people for the maximum number of benefit. And many funding agencies, AMED, European Commission, UKRI, NIH in the United States, Chinese Academy of Sciences, talk about the ability to do interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research. I haven't seen a funding agency that does it well. And one of the great challenges, I think, of the next decade in how we support science in countries is how actually to generate, not on paper, not pretending, but actually the reality of how we bring multidisciplinary teams together to address common problems. And we are falling behind. The sums we've heard from the European Union are very impressive for 27 countries plus associates. But the threat to scientific funding is very real. And I believe, again, this graph, which doesn't really matter what the numbers are, the trends are what's important. If you look at the graph from about 2015 onwards, the United States, and prior to that, China, their funding into the science took off. And I'm afraid to say the rest of the world more or less stood still. That will come back to haunt those countries beyond those 2 leading scientific agencies. And it is no surprise, as China invests more in its science, its rise of patents, its rise of academic publications, the rise of the universities in the country. Personally, I don't see that as a global geopolitical threat. Some may. What worries me more is that the countries that are not increasing their science base will fall increasingly behind. And if you go back to that original video, they will no longer in the 21st century be able to provide the wealth that their country needs in order to provide for that demographic shift. So investment in science, curiosity-driven science, translational science, across government, it's not just about life sciences and biomedical sciences, I believe is absolutely crucial to gaining or retaining middle and high income status. And if we allow these graphs to continue, then the increasing divergence and the route to products, if you think what's going to drive an economy in the 21st century, it's going to be know-how, it's going to be technology, it's going to be science of all its descriptions. It's going to be much less about manufacturing and commodities. It's going to be about a knowledge economy that drives jobs, opportunity, social mobility, and equity. So this is part of a piece of work. Most of my time here in Japan has been on a personal basis rather than as chief scientist at WHO. But this is part of a piece of work that we are working on in 2025 in order to try and address the imbalances between where science happens in the world. I spent 18 years living in Vietnam. Vietnam, as you know very well, is a very impressive country. What it's done economically over the last 20 years has been nothing short of extraordinary. And it has invested heavily in education and indeed in science. And that has driven its economic growth. I believe that domestic investment in science and education, domestic investment in science, rather than relying on international aid, is the route to self-national resilience. And so this piece of work is asking two questions, and we would dearly love to have Japan as part of this. Many countries have now joined. Two questions. If, as a country, mostly focused on middle income, but many lower middle income countries have asked to join, and some high income countries have asked to join. If you want to invest 1% or 2% or 5% of GDP in your basic infrastructure of science in your country, what is the best way of doing that to achieve your strategic ambitions? The amount of research on research, the amount of money we spend on research, but have no idea whether what we're doing is working, is extraordinary. That is somebody that was a clinical scientist, that was somebody who was head of a $50 billion organization called Wellcome Trust, and now somebody that works at the World Health Organization. Does peer review work? Should peer review be in English? Should it be international? Should you support young people or should you support senior people? How do you develop a career in science? How do you govern your institutions so that the public and the individuals within those institutions trust them? Will they get promotion based on their name or their ethnicity or their gender, or will they get promotion based on metrics? And if metrics, which metrics really demonstrate progress? Is a paper in a journal with a single name some surrogate for quality? How do you encourage particularly women who leave science in their droves in the middle of their careers to retain and be still part of the scientific ecosystem? How do you encourage people that want to stay in science but want to work in industry? How do you ensure that scientists don't see a career in policy making as a failure? He speaks, having gone from science to policy making. How do you ensure that young people coming through high school see science not as something boring in a white coat done in an elite by people they don't look like them, into something that they want to do when they have many other options for a career? Do you work in harmony across the European Union style? Is there a future for an ASEAN Horizon Asia, which puts the best minds of Asia together in a consortium? By giving up autonomy as an individual country, do you gain by pooling your resources to drive standards up on both sides, which is what I believe Horizon Europe does? And the second part of the question, which I think is equally important, there is no right and wrong, but how do countries structure their scientific advice into government? We saw across many countries during COVID, some countries had great data and made great decisions. Some countries had great data and made useless decisions. Some countries had no data, made good decisions or bad decisions. It was all over the place. There is no right and wrong answer to your scientific advice into government, but there are lessons to be learned from other countries. Every country may do it differently, but there are lessons to be learned. And so by pooling those lessons and say country X does it like this, country Y does it like this, when does it work, when does it not work? How do you include industry, the private sector and philanthropy in those discussions is, I think, a crucial element. And if we do not ensure that the scientific voices are fed into government decision making, not just in a pandemic, not just in a crisis, but every Monday and every Tuesday, then they won't be there when a crisis hits. And so these two questions, what are the options for how you structure your scientific ecosystems using your domestic resources, and how do you fund that? And secondly, how do you structure your scientific advice into government to ensure that government at least has access to the best scientific advice, not just in a pandemic or a crisis, because I do not believe you can establish systems in a crisis that were not there before the crisis unfolded. The other point I'd like to make, and I don't usually pay that much attention, I hate to say it, to the Nobel Prize for Economics every year. But this year was a special. 2024 was a very special economics prize. It was a combination of history and economics. And anybody who has worked with historians or economists know that those two tribes rarely talk to each other. This was a prize for economics that asked a very simple question. Do you get rich and wealthy and then establish institutions? Or do you establish institutions and the institutions themselves help you gain wealth and development? And the answer from this Nobel Prize was that you establish institutions first, and from those institutions you derive development and progress. There's a very important lesson in that for the future of how we think of our own countries as well as low and middle income countries. But those institutions cannot be static. They must be inclusive. They must evolve with time. Just because you established an institution 100 years ago doesn't mean to say it's fit for purpose in 2025. And so the institutions mustn't just be there, but they must also evolve over time and be consistent with the context of which the world is now operating in. And countries that do away with their institutions, and this may be happening in some countries at the moment, that is a red flag for a very, very concerning future. So these are the objectives. I won't go through all of these, but basically we are working, and now I'm talking as WHO, with all of our member states. That's currently 194. It may become 193 in January of next year. We hope not. To work out these two questions with interested parties. How do you support your scientific ecosystem to drive health, but also to drive economic growth, opportunity, and reduce inequality? And secondly, how do you structure your scientific advice into government? And this is being done particularly with the United Nations Science Advisory Board, which I sit on, and also UNESCO, who obviously, from a UN perspective, oversee scientific evidence within the UN system. And finally, I'll finish with a quote, because I think this is something from an article I wrote some time ago. I do believe that by strengthening and sustaining, I go back to the comment about mRNA not being invented in 2020, by strengthening and sustaining inclusive, diverse, national scientific ecosystems, we can create a future which addresses the challenges of the 21st century. And we can do that to create a more equitable world. If we do not do this, then my concern is, with science going on in a smaller number of countries, less in the public sector, more in the private sector in private hands, not even in public companies, that science itself, we will allow science itself to drive greater inequality. And ultimately, in the 21st century, if we allow greater inequality, I believe we will have more conflict, we will have more migration, we will have more pandemics, climate change will not be addressed, and we will not work together to solve the great challenges of the 21st century. I believe this is a responsibility of national governments. National governments cannot do everything, but they can create the environment that allows science to flourish. It allows society to trust the science. It allows companies to contribute to that science, and it does so in order to drive health, but it also does it to drive away and reduce inequality. That, I believe, is a national responsibility. It also ensures national security and national resilience. And all countries in the 21st century are going to need national resilience if we're going to address the great challenges of the 21st century. Many countries will look at that graph, OECD graph from earlier on, and say we can't afford it. We've got too many pressing issues to address today. We've got defense in Europe. We've got this. We've got that. The question is not whether a country can afford to invest in science. The question is whether a country can actually not afford to invest in science. Because by not investing in science, I believe the countries will be left behind and will fall further behind, even those that are currently high income or middle income. The future of the 21st century, however you define science, is by investing in science for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Jeremy Fowler. Thank you very much for your great presentation.